get an update on the Ukrainian-Russian crisis from a different angle now. We go to the headquarters of the European Union, Brussels. A journalist there is standing by for us, Christine Mhundwa. Christine is the European correspondent for Germany's DW News. Christine, good afternoon to you. I do appreciate the time. The European Union imposing sanctions on Russia, not sending troops, but imposing sanctions. How far do these sanctions go?
Well, it depends who you're asking here, Stephen, because there is divided opinion even among the Europeans about whether or not these sanctions could have gone tougher. We've heard from the Council, the European Council President Charles Michel. He said that these sanctions were massive and that they would be painful. And by some indication, they will be, because if it goes as planned, Stephen, you will see inflation in Russia. This is likely to impact ordinary households in Russia, bearing in mind a lot of people are already living very close to poverty in Russia. You're likely to see some form of economic recession in Russia because of these sanctions in the medium term, and that will no doubt mean some businesses will succumb to that. That's job losses. They've targeted an additional number of sectors, the transport sector for one. Perhaps most crippling, beyond making it more difficult for the Russians to access capital markets and financial markets in the Western world, is that they're going to be blocking the export of certain technologies. We're talking about things like semiconductors. These are things that you need to fire up your computer or your laptop. So you can imagine, how do you develop or grow in an economy when you don't have access, or at least restricted access, to important products like that are not easily available at an alternative. So by design, these are not necessarily made to stop Putin. That's way too late for that. But you have some member states who have felt that these could be more harsher. But bear in mind, there are a lot of different interests when it comes to European Union economies. The sanctions they impose on Russia will have an impact on some European economies, right? On some more than others. So definitely in certain quarters, people feel like more could have been done, even among the Europeans, never mind the sentiment coming out of Ukraine and other places as well.
We all know, I mean, it's obvious the big real power is cutting Russia out of the big international payments banking system, SWIFT. Why has the EU, why has that not happened yet?
Well, Stephen, I was talking about self-interest right now, and it really came down to two countries, Germany and Italy. And this has really got to do with one side of the coin, is that it's about self-interest, right? Germany is massively reliant on Russian gas. It is also a massive exporter to Russia. A lot of German goods going into Russia. Similarly with Italy, over the years, you've seen a lot more business ties between Italy and Russia. For these two countries, cutting Russia off from SWIFT, which would effectively make it near impossible to send money in and out of Russia, would make their business dealings with Russia impossible. So you're looking at the first and third biggest economies in Europe considering their own economic interests here. And of course, they stand a lot more to lose than other countries would because of their gas dependency and other economic relationships with Russia. So that is one side of the story. The other side of the argument that is being put on the table by the European leaders, or some of them who agree that Russia should not yet be banned off of SWIFT, is that this is the biggest gun they have yet. And why fire your biggest gun now? You need to keep some level of leverage. We're talking about a full-scale invasion now, Stephen, but if this evolves into some kind of a protracted war, you need to have some leverage to go to Moscow with, right? And they're saying, let's leave that as a last resort. But for example, that has drawn criticism here in Europe as well. The former European Council President, Donald Tusk, he didn't hold back, right? Tweeting that these countries that have blocked these sanctions like SWIFT, he said, have disgraced themselves. And he was specifically talking about the Germans, the Hungarians, and the Italians, who have been at the forefront of urging the bloc not to impose such measures. So the Ukrainians have criticized it across the board. There is criticism in Europe as well on that specific measure.
I suppose in some ways, sometimes you do just deploy your rook or your castle and your bishop. You keep the queen in the game of chess for when you really, really need it. In some ways, Christine, I don't need to tell you this. This has all been such a big shock to the European Union. In some ways, it's also dependent on what Russia does. But Germany in particular, we all know, needs Russian gas. And then just to sort of explain, in South Africa, you don't need gas to stay warm. Gas is something you might use to cook, but you don't need it to stay warm. In Germany and in Europe, you do. How big a factor is that in all of these calculations?
It's a massive factor. In fact, one of the things about this, leading up to this invasion, when Western leaders and leaders all around the world were engaging in this diplomacy in an effort to deter Vladimir Putin from taking the decision to invade Ukraine, was this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That is a massive gas pipeline that's been built to transport gas directly from Russia into Germany, going under the Baltic Sea. There is already existing infrastructure, bearing in mind currently the gas that comes through to Western Europe and other countries on the continent comes via Ukraine. And so, this was always a contentious issue. Washington had a big problem with this project, Nord Stream 2, because the U.S. felt that this would further increase Europe's dependency on gas. Now, you're quite right. Gas is how people keep warm in Europe. In fact, there were fears of a cold winter if Vladimir Putin would retaliate to these sanctions by turning off of the gas. So gas is really important, and gas from Russia specifically is important to Europe, because a third of Europe's gas supply, that's how Europeans fire up their homes to keep warm in freezing cold temperatures, comes from Russia. So, and it is also for Russia one of its most important industries. This is the place where gas exports is where Russia gets most of its foreign currency revenues. So gas was always a big factor. That Nord Stream 2 pipeline that the German president only this week, after weeks of being pressured by other leaders, announced that he would be halting that project. The infrastructure has been built. It's a 10 billion euro project that's essentially being tanked now. But there's not a lot of sympathy for countries like Germany, especially from Baltic countries and countries like Poland, who've long been saying we need to wean ourselves off of the dependency on Russia when it comes to gas. We need to invest in renewables, for example. So this project by the Germans to build a pipeline directly funneling gas from Russia was always a problem because of this dependency factor. Well, it was eventually put on the table. It has been halted. And clearly that was not enough to deter Vladimir Putin in terms of taking the decision that he has to invade Ukraine. It appears Ukraine is more lucrative to him than another avenue to transport gas into the European Union.
Sure. The U.S. President Joe Biden, he's having a virtual meeting with other NATO leaders. We may be able to bring some of that live to our viewers in a few moments. But what are you expecting from that? Are you expecting anything critical?
Nothing critical, Stephen. We're certainly not going to hear NATO saying it's going to be deploying any Western troops to go fight alongside the Ukrainians. Right now, we pretty much know that the Ukrainians are on their own. There will be no Western soldiers being deployed to fight alongside Ukrainians. What this has done now is it has made other Europe or NATO allies feel a little bit more vulnerable. And I'm talking specifically about the Baltic states. This is Estonia, this is Lithuania, this is Latvia. These are former Soviet republics who are right on the border with Russia, who now fear that because this invasion of Ukraine has gone through, that they might potentially be next. They fear, for example, cyber attacks from Moscow. They fear a disinformation campaign that would be targeted specifically at ethnic Russian communities in their country. So what NATO has done is it has put provisions in place. It has got warships, about 120 warships, a similar number of battle planes on high alert. NATO took the step to give its top commander, General Todd Walters, special powers. That is, that he can effectively say the word and deploy NATO's rapid response force without having to go through the procedure of consulting the 30 allies. So in this meeting, they are going to be discussing, of course, Joe Biden is going to be joining. It's a virtual summit that's going to be chaired by the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, from Brussels. They're going to discuss the vulnerability of other NATO member states and other provisions, additional provisions that might be needed. We know that they're bolstering the eastern flank. That is, they're sending more resource as well as troop deployments to countries like Romania, to countries like Poland and the Baltic countries that I just mentioned. In the event that Russia were to attack an ally, we would see NATO triggering its responses. I'll point out here that the most that NATO could do is trigger Article 5. Article 5 is basically NATO going to war on behalf of an ally or a member state, of which Ukraine is not. We've only seen NATO ever trigger Article 5 one time in its history, and that was in response to the 9/11 attacks, when NATO deployed troops to Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks in the United States. So it is going to be the discussion largely around how to deal with the situation that some Baltic states and other European member states feel vulnerable now. In addition to the NATO meeting, Stephen, I'll just point out here that also in Brussels, the foreign ministers of the European Union are going to be meeting. That's an in-person meeting. And they're likely to also be discussing the issue around refugees. Indeed, Ukrainians are already fleeing by the masses, pouring into the European Union. Poland, for example, noted that some 29,000 people have crossed into Poland in the last 24 hours. That number is probably growing. So they've now got to discuss the issue of sharing the load when it comes to refugees, and that's always been a contentious issue in the European Union, sharing the load when it comes to migration. That is obviously going to be something they'll be discussing today.